Have you ever stopped to think that a single daily decision can completely transform a life? Not a decision made once in a lifetime, but a decision repeated every day, quietly when no one is watching. A choice that does not depend on applause, recognition, or favorable circumstances. A choice that is born within the soul and repeats itself day after day until it shapes the destiny of a person. That is exactly what happened in the life of John Wesley. Today he is remembered as one of the men who most influenced modern Christianity. His sermons crossed centuries. His impact reached millions of people. His spiritual discipline became a reference for entire generations of Christians. But behind all of this history, there is something much simpler, and at the same time much deeper: a daily decision. It was not an extraordinary event. It was not a spectacular miracle before crowds. It was not a momentary experience that changed everything all at once. It was something quiet, something constant, something he decided to do every day of his life. The decision to seek God with all his heart. This decision began very early. Wesley grew up in a home deeply marked by faith. His father was a pastor, and his mother, Susanna Wesley, was known for her spiritual discipline and for her dedication to the spiritual education of her children. She taught them to read the scriptures, to pray, and to reflect on life before God. But the kind of faith that transforms a life cannot simply be inherited. At some point it must become personal. And that is exactly what happened with Wesley. During his younger years, he was known for his spiritual seriousness. He tried to live a morally upright life. He studied the Bible with dedication. He practiced spiritual disciplines. But despite all this dedication, there was a deep restlessness inside him. Something seemed to be missing. He was doing many things right, yet he still did not feel that inner assurance many Christians described. He obeyed, studied, prayed, but still felt that his faith needed something deeper. This restlessness did not push him away from God. On the contrary, it pushed him into an even deeper search. During this period, Wesley began organizing his spiritual life with almost remarkable discipline. He did not want to live a superficial faith. He wanted to know God in a real way. So he began to make a simple yet radical decision. Every day he would set aside time for God. No matter how busy he was, no matter how tired he was, no matter what was happening around him, every day. At first, this decision may seem small when we hear about it, but when repeated over years, it becomes powerful. Wesley began waking up very early, often before sunrise. While the city was still asleep, he was already in prayer. He believed the first hours of the day were the most important, because the mind was calmer and the heart more sensitive. He read the scriptures slowly, reflecting on every word. It was not merely reading. It was meditation. It was a dialogue with God. He prayed with intensity, as someone who truly believed that God was listening to every word. He examined his own life. He asked himself whether his attitudes were aligned with what Christ taught. He reflected on his thoughts, his intentions, and his actions. This daily practice began to shape his life. But Wesley did not stop there. He also believed that faith needed to be lived in community. So he gathered with a small group of friends at the University of Oxford. This group became known as the Holy Club. The name was given ironically by other students. They thought the spiritual discipline of those young men was excessive. They found it strange that they prayed so much, studied so much, and took faith so seriously. But Wesley did not care about the criticism. He knew he was building something many people still could not understand. In that small group they did something that seemed simple but was actually very profound. They held one another accountable. They asked each other difficult questions. Did you pray today? Did you help someone in need this week? Did you live according to what you believe? These questions kept their consciences awake. The daily decision to seek God was not only an individual practice, it was a lifestyle. But even with all this discipline, Wesley would still face a decisive moment in his spiritual journey, because spiritual discipline does not replace a true encounter with the grace of God. For years, Wesley tried to live a faith based mainly on personal effort. He wanted to please God. He wanted to live correctly. He wanted to do everything right. But deep inside, he still carried a burden. Until one day, something happened that would change his life forever. On May 24, 1738, Wesley attended a small meeting on Aldersgate Street in London. Someone was reading Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. It was not a grand event. There were no crowds. There was no emotional music. Just a few people gathered together, listening to a text being read. But in that moment, something happened inside Wesley's heart. Later, he described it with words that became famous. "My heart was strangely warmed." In that moment, he understood something that changed everything. Salvation was not achieved through human effort. It was a gift of God's grace. All the spiritual discipline Wesley practiced now found its true foundation. He would continue praying. He would continue studying the scriptures. He would continue living a disciplined life. But now it would no longer be an attempt to earn God's love. It would be a response to the love he had already received. The daily decision would continue. But now it came from a transformed heart. And from that moment on, Wesley's life began to impact the world in ways no one could have imagined. If this story is already making you reflect on your own spiritual life, write in the comments, what daily decision do you believe could transform your walk with God? And if you want to continue discovering how Wesley's spiritual discipline changed not only his life but also the history of Christianity, keep watching. The daily decision that began quietly in the life of John Wesley did not remain only in the field of personal devotion. Over time, that spiritual discipline began producing something visible, something no one could ignore. Because when someone decides every day to sincerely seek God, something inevitably begins to change inside them. And when something changes inside a person, sooner or later it begins to overflow outward. That is exactly what happened with Wesley. After the experience he had at Aldersgate, when he felt his heart strangely warmed, his faith stopped being merely an intense search for holiness and became a living faith, filled with confidence in the grace of God. Spiritual discipline remained part of his routine, but now it had a new meaning. Before, he sought God out of fear that he was not doing enough. Now he sought God with joy, knowing he was already loved. And this inner transformation completely changed the way he lived and preached. Wesley began speaking about the grace of God with a passion that deeply touched people's hearts. He spoke about a living faith, a real relationship with God, a life transformed by the divine presence. But there was a problem. At that time, many churches were not open to this kind of message. The religious environment in England was in many places cold and formal. Many religious leaders were more concerned with structures and traditions than with the spiritual transformation of people. Wesley began to notice something that deeply troubled him. Churches were full of religious people, but empty of spiritual life. Meanwhile, outside the churches, crowds lived without any hope. Poor workers, miners, farmers, people forgotten by society, people who were rarely reached by the message of the gospel. At that moment, Wesley made another courageous decision. If people would not come to the church, he would go to them. And that was when something revolutionary began to happen. Wesley started preaching outdoors. Today this might seem normal, but at that time it was extremely unusual for a clergyman of the Church of England. Many considered the practice improper, almost scandalous, but Wesley believed that the mission of proclaiming the gospel was more important than any social convention. He began preaching in open fields, at the entrances of towns, near coal mines, in the places where workers spent their days struggling to survive. And something extraordinary began to happen. People stopped to listen. At first there were only a few. Then there were dozens. Then hundreds. and sometimes thousands. Men and women who had never felt that God cared about them began hearing a different message. Because Wesley spoke about a God who forgives, who transforms, who offers a new life. He spoke about a Christ who died for everyone, not only for the rich or the religious. And as he preached, many people wept, many repented, many felt they were hearing something their hearts had been searching for all their lives. But none of this happened by accident, because behind every powerful sermon, behind every crowd that was touched, behind every transformed life, there was that same daily decision that Wesley never abandoned. He continued waking up early, continued praying, continued reading the scriptures, and continued examining his own life before God, even when his schedule began to grow extremely demanding. Wesley traveled thousands of kilometers on horseback to preach. In some years, he covered more than 8,000 kilometers. He preached several times a day, faced cold weather, rain, persecution, and criticism, and yet his spiritual routine remained firm. He understood something that many people forget. Ministry without spiritual life becomes empty. Religious activity without communion with God becomes nothing more than human effort. That is why Wesley protected that time with God as if it were the most precious treasure of his life. And it was exactly this quiet faithfulness that sustained everything that came afterward. Over the years, the movement that began with small meetings and open-air preaching began to grow in a surprising way. Transformed people started gathering in small groups to study the Bible, pray, and encourage one another. These groups became known as classes, and they were not merely religious meetings. They were spiritual communities, people walking together, sharing their struggles, helping one another live a real faith in everyday life. This model spread rapidly. Entire cities began to feel the impact. Many people who had been trapped in alcoholism, violence, and despair found a new direction for their lives. Families were restored. Communities were transformed. And all of this began with something that seemed too small to attract attention. A daily decision. A decision to seek God every day. A decision not to allow the busyness of life to suffocate what mattered most. It is impressive to think that while Wesley was traveling, preaching, and organizing entire communities, he still maintained his spiritual discipline with the same seriousness as before. For him, intimacy with God was non-negotiable. It was not something he did only when he had time. It was something he did because he knew that without it, everything would lose its meaning. Perhaps here lies one of the greatest lessons from Wesley's life. Many people want to live great spiritual experiences, but they are not willing to cultivate small daily decisions. They want deep results without constant commitment. They want transformation without spiritual discipline. They want spiritual growth without consistency in prayer, in reading the Word, and in communion with God. Yet Wesley's life shows us something powerful and simple at the same time. True transformation begins with a decision that is repeated every day, silently, faithfully, without applause, but full of purpose before God. The daily decision that marked the life of Wesley did not end with the formation of a great spiritual movement. It continued shaping every detail of his journey until the end of his life. As the years passed, Wesley became one of the most influential spiritual voices of his time. Yet what sustained everything he did remained something simple, quiet, and deeply spiritual: his daily communion with God. It is interesting to notice that while his fame was growing and larger, crowds came to hear him. Wesley never allowed the success of his ministry to replace his life of devotion. On the contrary, the more responsibilities he assumed, the more he protected his time with God. For him, prayer was not a religious obligation. It was the place where his soul found direction, correction, and strength. Wesley deeply believed that a person does not become spiritually strong only through extraordinary moments, but through a quiet consistency that happens every day. He often examined his own life with very serious questions. Am I living in a way that pleases God? Do my words reflect the love of Christ? Am I using my time for what truly matters? These questions were not meant to produce guilt, but to keep his heart aligned with what God desired. This habit of spiritual self-examination was part of a very intentional way of life. Wesley organized his day with great discipline. Every hour had a purpose. There was time for prayer, time for reading the scriptures, time for study, time for serving people, and time for preaching. For many people, this might seem too rigid, but for Wesley it was spiritual freedom, because he knew exactly where his life was being invested. Another remarkable characteristic of his routine was his care for the heart. Wesley understood that the true Christian life was not merely about avoiding outward mistakes. It was about allowing God to transform the deepest motivations of the soul. He often spoke about holiness of heart, an expression that described an inner life shaped by the love of God. Because of this, Wesley taught that true faith reveals itself in three very clear dimensions: love for God, love for neighbor, and a life of practical obedience. For him, these three things could never be separated. A person who claimed to love God but ignored the needs of others had not yet understood the heart of the gospel. This understanding led Wesley to develop something very powerful within the Methodist movement: the practice of spiritual accountability in community. The people who attended the meetings were not there merely to listen to messages. They were encouraged to share their struggles, confess their weaknesses, and seek spiritual growth together. This model created extremely strong communities. People who once lived isolated lives began walking together, helping one another live a real faith in the midst of life's difficulties. While all this was happening, Wesley continued traveling from city to city. Many times he woke up before sunrise to pray, and then rode long distances to preach in villages, cities, and open fields. On some days he preached 3, 4, or even 5 times. The conditions were not always easy. There were moments of strong opposition. Some people criticized his messages, others mocked his meetings, and on certain occasions, hostile crowds tried to stop his preaching. Yet Wesley remained firm. And why did he remain firm? Because his strength did not come merely from intellectual convictions. It came from a life deeply rooted in the presence of God. This may be one of the deepest lessons from Wesley's story. People who build their spiritual lives only on momentary emotions tend to grow weary quickly, but people who develop consistent spiritual discipline find a source of strength that remains even in difficult days. Wesley knew that there would be moments of exhaustion, moments of doubt, and moments of challenge, but he also knew that daily faithfulness always produces fruit over time. When we look at his life, we realize that many of the things that today seem extraordinary began with small and repeated decisions. It was not a single moment that changed everything. It was a daily commitment that remained steady through the years. Perhaps that is why his story continues to inspire people even today. Because when someone observes Wesley's life, they see something that is still incredibly relevant. God continues to work through people who decide to seek Him sincerely every single day. And perhaps the most important question that arises after hearing this story is this: what daily decision is shaping your own life? All of us make decisions every day. Some of them are small, almost unnoticed, but over time they shape the direction of our journey. Some decisions draw our hearts closer to God. Others slowly pull us away from what truly matters. Wesley's life reminds us that a single decision, repeated every day, can completely transform a story. Choosing to pray even when the day begins in a rush. Choosing to open the scriptures even when the mind feels tired. Choosing to align the heart with God before facing the challenges of daily life. These choices may seem simple, but they carry extraordinary power when they become a consistent part of life. Perhaps this is exactly what many people need to rediscover today. Spiritual transformation does not happen only in great events or in rare moments. It happens above all in daily faithfulness. And if this message spoke to you, write in the comments which spiritual decision you want to begin practicing every day. Sharing that decision may be the first step toward a new journey. And if you want to continue learning deep lessons about faith, spiritual discipline, and life transformation, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. In doing so, you help this message reach more people who are also seeking to grow spiritually. Because sometimes all God needs to begin, something extraordinary, is a simple decision made today and repeated tomorrow.